This is ugly. That's what Mom always said when she saw my drawings, right before she'd tear them up and throw them away. I stopped showing her anything after that, but I never stopped drawing. At my New York exhibition, she stood in the corner. I recognized her by her eyes. I started drawing when I was maybe 6 years old. My hands were always covered in pencil smudges, and I'd find myself sketching on everything: napkins at restaurants, the margins of my school notebooks, even the condensation on windows. There was something about putting lines on paper that made sense to me in a way that nothing else did. When other kids were playing video games or watching cartoons, I was hunched over a piece of paper, completely lost in whatever world I was creating. The problem was we never had proper art supplies. Money was tight, and Mom made it clear that drawing materials weren't a priority. So I learned to make do with whatever I could find. Old newspapers became my canvas, and I'd carefully tear out sections that had the least amount of text, using the blank spaces between articles. The paper was thin and would tear easily, but it was better than nothing. I'd save up my allowance for weeks just to buy a new set of colored pencils, treating each one like it was made of gold. Mom's reaction was always the same. She'd find my drawings scattered around my room or tucked into books, and her face would scrunch up like she'd tasted something sour. She'd hold up whatever I'd been working on and shake her head. The disappointment in her voice was unmistakable when she'd tell me I wasn't an artist and that I needed to stop embarrassing myself. She'd crumple up hours of work and toss it in the trash without a second thought. I remember one particular afternoon when I was about 8. I'd spent the entire weekend working on a series of drawings of our neighborhood. I'd walked around for hours, sketching the old oak tree on our street, the way the light hit the corner store in the evening, the stray cat that always sat on Mrs. Patterson's fence. I was so proud of those drawings. They felt different from my usual work, more real, more meaningful somehow. When Mom found them, she didn't just throw them away. She took all 12 sheets and walked straight to the bathroom. I followed her, confused, watching as she tore each drawing into smaller pieces and dropped them into the toilet. Then she flushed. The water swirled, and weeks of work disappeared down the drain. She turned to me and said I needed to find something more productive to do with my time. That was the moment I decided I'd never show her my art again. I'd keep drawing, but it would be my secret. I got better at hiding my work, finding creative places to stash my drawings where she'd never think to look. Under my mattress, taped to the inside of my closet door, rolled up inside old magazines. I developed a whole system of concealment that would have impressed a spy. The secrecy actually made me more dedicated to my art. Since I couldn't share it with anyone, I poured everything into making it better. I'd study the way shadows fell across objects, how different materials reflected light, how to capture emotion in simple lines. I taught myself by checking out art books from the library, copying techniques from masters whose names I could barely pronounce. High school was when things started to change. I had an art teacher who noticed my work during a class assignment. She pulled me aside and asked why I'd never taken formal art classes. When I explained that my mom didn't support it, she offered to let me stay after school to work in the art room. Those afternoons became my sanctuary. I'd spend hours there, experimenting with different mediums, learning proper techniques, finally having access to real art supplies. The teacher encouraged me to enter a local student art competition, but I was terrified. What if Mom found out? What if she was right and I really wasn't any good? But something inside me needed to know. I submitted 3 pieces under a pseudonym, using the school's address instead of my home address. When I won second place, I felt like I was floating. Someone who wasn't me thought my work was worth something. That one gave me the confidence to start thinking about college. I researched art programs, saved money from a part-time job, and applied to schools far enough away that I could start fresh. Mom thought I was studying business administration, and I never corrected her. It was easier to let her believe what she wanted to believe. College was like stepping into a different world. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who understood what it meant to see the world through an artist's eyes. I threw myself into my studies, spending countless nights in the studio, experimenting with different styles and techniques. My professors pushed me to dig deeper, to find my own voice among all the influences I'd absorbed over the years. The loneliness was hard, though. While my classmates talked about their families supporting their dreams, I kept my background to myself. I'd make excuses for why my parents never visited, why I never went home for holidays unless I absolutely had to. The shame of having a mother who saw my passion as something embarrassing was something I carried like a weight in my chest. But the work sustained me. I developed a style that was uniquely mine, combining realistic techniques with emotional depth that seemed to resonate with people. My professors started mentioning opportunities, gallery showings, competitions, connections in the art world. It felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. The breakthrough came during my senior year. A gallery owner in New York saw my work at a student exhibition and offered me a spot in a group show. It wasn't a solo exhibition, but it was New York, and it was real. I was going to be a professional artist, showing my work in one of the most important art cities in the world. I didn't tell Mom about the show. Part of me wanted to prove I could make it without her support or approval. But another part of me was still that 8-year-old kid watching his drawings get flushed down the toilet, and I wasn't ready to risk that kind of rejection again. The opening night was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The gallery was packed with people who seemed to genuinely appreciate art, who looked at my pieces with the same intensity I'd felt when creating them. Collectors were asking about prices, other artists were introducing themselves, and critics were taking notes. I felt like I was in a dream. I was standing near one of my larger pieces, watching people's reactions, when I noticed someone by the window. She was wearing a headscarf and standing slightly apart from the crowd, but there was something familiar about her posture. When she turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of her profile, and my heart stopped. It was Mom. She was trying to blend into the background, but I knew those eyes, the way she held her shoulders when she was uncomfortable. She was studying my artwork with an intensity I'd never seen from her before. Not the dismissive glances she'd given my childhood drawings, but real attention, like she was trying to understand something important. I watched her move from piece to piece, spending long minutes in front of each one. Her expression was unreadable, but she didn't look away. She didn't scrunch up her face or shake her head. She just looked, really looked, at what I'd created. Update 1. I couldn't approach her. Every time I thought about walking over, my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. What would I even say? How do you bridge 20 years of silence about the thing that matters most to you? So I stayed where I was, watching her from across the room, trying to read her face like I used to read the light from my drawings. About an hour into the opening, I saw her talking to someone at the front desk. She was being discreet about it, but I could tell she was asking questions. The receptionist was pointing to different pieces, and Mom was nodding, taking it all in. Then she did something that completely floored me. She pulled out a small notebook and started writing things down. She was taking notes about my art. The strangest part was how she looked at my work. Growing up, I'd always felt like she saw my drawings as something shameful, something that reflected poorly on our family. But watching her at the gallery, I realized she was seeing them as art for the first time. Real art. Not the scribblings of a child who needed to find better ways to spend his time, but actual artistic expression that had value. She spent almost 3 hours there, longer than most of the other visitors. I kept thinking she might come over to me, might acknowledge that she knew who I was, but she never did. She maintained her distance, like she was trying to experience my work without the complication of our relationship getting in the way. When she finally left, I felt this weird mix of relief and disappointment. I wanted to run after her, to finally have the conversation we'd never had about my art, but I also wasn't sure I was ready for whatever that conversation might reveal. What if she still thought it was all nonsense? What if she was only there out of curiosity, not pride? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about seeing her there. I kept replaying the image of her standing in front of my paintings, actually studying them instead of dismissing them. It was such a departure from every interaction we'd had about my art that I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I got a call from the gallery. The receptionist mentioned that someone had come in the day before asking detailed questions about my background, my training, my other work. They'd wanted to know if I had more pieces, if I was working on anything new, if there were plans for a solo exhibition in the future. The person had been very interested but hadn't left their name. I knew it had to be her. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times she'd torn up my drawings, all the times she'd told me I wasn't an artist. Had she really changed her mind, or was this just curiosity? I thought about calling her, but we'd barely spoken in years, and I wasn't sure how to bring up the fact that I'd seen her at the gallery without making it awkward for both of us. Instead, I decided to do what I'd always done when I didn't know how to process something. I drew. I spent the next week creating a series of pieces about childhood, about hiding parts of yourself, about the complicated relationship between dreams and family expectations. The work was more personal than anything I'd done before, but it felt necessary. Update 2. 3 months later, the gallery called with an opportunity one never expected. They wanted to give me a solo exhibition, not just a few pieces in a group show, but an entire exhibition of my work. They'd been impressed by the response to my pieces and thought I was ready for the next step. I was terrified and thrilled at the same time. The solo show was scheduled for 6 months later, which gave me time to create new work and carefully curate the pieces I wanted to include. I decided to organize it around the theme of hidden selves, the parts of who we are that we keep private, either by choice or by necessity. It felt like the most honest representation of my artistic journey. As the opening date approached, I faced the same dilemma I'd had before. Should I tell Mom about the show? Part of me wanted her to know, especially after seeing her at the last exhibition. But another part of me was still protecting that wounded kid who'd watched his art get flushed down the toilet. I compromised by not actively hiding it. I mentioned it to a few relatives who might let it slip, posted about it on social media where she could see it if she looked, but I didn't send her a direct invitation. If she wanted to come, she'd have to make that choice herself. The week of the opening, I was a nervous wreck. This was my first solo show, and the pressure felt enormous. What if nobody came? What if the critics hated it? What if I'd been fooling myself all these years and Mom had been right about my lack of talent? But opening night exceeded every expectation I'd had. The gallery was packed, and people were responding to the work in ways that made me understand why I'd never been able to stop drawing, even when it felt like the whole world was against it. Collectors were making offers, and several pieces sold before the evening was half over. About 2 hours into the opening, I was talking to a collector about one of my newer pieces when I saw her again. This time, she wasn't trying to hide. She was standing near the entrance, looking around the room with what I could only describe as wonder. She was dressed more formally than the last time, like she'd made an effort for the occasion. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither of us moved. 20 years of complicated history hung in the air between us. Then she did something that surprised me. She smiled. Not a big smile, but a small, uncertain one that seemed to acknowledge everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said. I walked over to her, my heart pounding. When I got close enough, I could see that her eyes were watery, like she was trying not to cry. She looked at me and then at the walls covered with my art, and I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen before when she looked at my work: pride. She didn't say much, just asked me to tell her about some of the pieces. So I did. I explained the techniques I'd used, the ideas behind different works, the emotions I'd been trying to capture. She listened to every word, asking thoughtful questions that showed she'd been paying attention not just to my art, but to me as a person. Near the end of the evening, she pulled out a small wrapped package. Inside was a set of professional-grade colored pencils, the kind I'd dreamed of having as a kid but could never afford. There was a note with them that simply said she was sorry it had taken her so long to understand. Final update. The months following that second exhibition changed everything between us. We started having regular conversations, not just about art but about life, about the dreams we'd both had to set aside at different points, about the fears that had made her react so strongly to my drawings when I was young. She admitted that seeing my passion for art had scared her. She'd grown up in a family where creativity was seen as impractical, where artistic pursuits were considered luxuries that poor families couldn't afford. When she saw me pouring so much energy into drawing, she worried I was setting myself up for disappointment and financial struggle. Her harsh reactions had come from a place of fear, not malice. But watching me succeed, seeing people respond to my work with respect and genuine interest, had forced her to confront her own assumptions. She bought that ticket to my first show under a different name because she'd been curious, but also ashamed of how she'd treated my art over the years. She hadn't known how to approach me, how to acknowledge that she'd been wrong without making it about her guilt. The professional colored pencils became the first art supplies she'd ever bought me, and I treasured them not just for their quality but for what they represented. It was her way of saying she understood now, that she saw my art as legitimate and valuable. We started a tradition of meeting once a month at different galleries around the city. She'd never been much of an art person before, but she was genuinely interested in learning. She'd ask me to explain different techniques, to tell her what I saw in pieces that moved me, to help her understand the language of visual art that had always been foreign to her. My career continued to grow. I had more solo exhibitions, pieces in museum collections, and commissions from collectors who'd followed my work from those early group shows. But none of those successes felt as meaningful as the quiet moment when Mom would study one of my new pieces and nod with understanding. She never explicitly apologized for flushing my drawings down the toilet or for all the times she dismissed my work as worthless. But she didn't need to. Every thoughtful question about my artistic process, every time she bragged to her friends about my latest exhibition, every proud smile when someone complimented my work in her presence. Those were apologies in themselves. The most surprising thing was discovering that she'd kept one of my childhood drawings all these years. It was tucked away in a box of important papers, creased and yellowed but intact. She'd saved it even during the period when she was tearing up everything else I made. When she showed it to me, I realized that even when she was fighting against my artistic dreams, some part of her had recognized their importance. Looking back, I understand now that we were both doing the best we could with the tools we had. She was trying to protect me from what she saw as an uncertain future, and I was trying to protect the part of myself that felt most essential. The tragedy was that we spent so many years protecting ourselves from each other instead of finding a way to support each other's fears and dreams. My art has evolved over the years, but the themes of hidden selves and complicated family relationships continue to appear in my work. The experience of having my early artistic efforts rejected and then later celebrated has given me a deep appreciation for the courage it takes to create anything meaningful. Every time I see a young artist struggling with self-doubt or family pressure, I think about that 8-year-old kid watching his drawing swirl down the toilet, and I try to offer the encouragement I wish I'd had. The relationship with my mother isn't perfect now. We still have moments of misunderstanding, and there are aspects of my artistic life that she doesn't fully grasp. But there's a fundamental respect there that didn't exist before. She sees me as a real artist now, not just her son who has an impractical hobby. And I see her as someone who was doing her best to guide me, even when her guidance felt like rejection. Sometimes I think about how different things might have been if she'd supported my art from the beginning. Would I have been more confident? Would I have achieved success earlier? But then I realized that the struggle to create despite opposition gave my work a depth and emotional resonance that might not have existed otherwise. The pain of having my art dismissed taught me to value it more deeply when it was finally recognized. The most important lesson I learned wasn't about art technique or career strategy. It was about the power of persistence and the possibility of change. People can surprise you, even people who seem set in their ways. Sometimes the person who seems most opposed to your dreams is actually the one who's most afraid of seeing you get hurt pursuing them. Now, when I stand in galleries surrounded by my work, I sometimes catch myself looking for her in the crowd. Not because I need her approval anymore, but because sharing that space with her feels like completing a circle that started when I was 6 years old and picked up my first pencil. The art exists on its own terms now, but having her witness and understand it adds a layer of meaning that I didn't know I was missing. The colored pencils she gave me still sit on my studio desk, even though I rarely use them anymore. They're a reminder that it's never too late for people to see each other clearly. Never too late to acknowledge that love can look like rejection when it's filtered through fear. My mother may have flushed my drawings down the toilet, but she also bought a ticket to see them hang in a New York gallery. Both of those actions came from the same person, and somehow, that makes perfect sense.